What's this? St. John's wort? Aren't you knowledgeable? It's just some herbs to repel bugs. Don't mind it. And it seems you were right. It's a study. It's tight in here, but the length is good. Let's see what we can find. I hope we have records made by the previous heads. I found a diary. Already? Let me look. We started looking around. Like we expected, the thick diary had writings left by all the previous heads of the Nosato family. It began with his great-grandfather, and the others added more after their retirements. All of them had strange handwriting, and according to what Kiyonosuke could make out, it was a highly detailed document and had references to other texts here. We could really tell it belonged to a family of scholars. The index on the diary referenced the documents all over the room, and the diary itself was like a description of what went on behind the scenes in Fujiyoshi. Kiyonosuke's great-grandfather was a genius who gathered immense wealth, but also a madman who threw it all away. His writings were especially difficult to read, analyze, and understand. However, the feeling behind it couldn't be more obvious. It was anguish. Anguish at the fact that he'd found a rational solution and began to doubt the superstitions. The preamble went like this. Why do we submit to Great Lord Shinai? Outsiders would see our beliefs as pure madness. Even so, we take the passion we should direct to our parents and children and instead dedicate it to our faith. That alone would not mean much, but when you see the shadow of Great Lord Shinai over our daily lives, we become fearful and absolutely loyal to him, like well-trained dogs. The slavery of the mind will still shackle us when the era of enlightenment reaches our home. That is why I have decided to take up the will of the crow. I so neglected and began my research. I hope that it bears fruit and mankind, not God, benefits from it, breaking free of the centuries of ignorance. This was written by Kiyonosuke's great-grandfather shortly after his roller's head was passed down, when he was still in his healthy 40s. Upon reading this, Kiyonosuke looked conflicted. The great-grandfather he thought to be a madman was actually both reasonable and intelligent. I also had something to think about it. He challenged God. That absurd endeavor might have been the reason why he'd gone mad. The diary had 3 sections. In the first one, the great-grandfather tried to pinpoint the origin of Fujiyoshi. He wanted to find the invisible chains binding him by looking at where they started and where they were going. However, that was difficult. Trying to find documents in Fujiyoshi would have attracted the attention of the other families, particularly the Miguruma, who'd then obstruct his work. Our legends say that we were protected by Shinai. By looking for proof claiming otherwise, we would be betraying his compassion, and that was the height of disrespect. It was also a time when not everyone went to schools, and literacy levels were really low. Thus, most of the records were held by the head families. However, there was no record of one of them trying to check another family's records, and that would obviously be met with opposition. Thus, he looked at the historical documents from outside Fujiyoshi. With the settlement being such a strange place, he figured that there would be many records about it made by outsiders. He was completely right. There were lots of old writings in the nearby villages and towns. Since it was wartime and the economy was dire, the paper was about to be wasted on fixing sliding. He used his own funds to acquire these precious documents. They were now organized and placed somewhere in the room. But anyway, he was able to locate Fujiyoshi's roots. It happened 600 years ago during the Muromashi period, a bit before the Sengoku. According to the documents, the place now known as Kami Fujiyoshi began as a hunter settlement. This place was a hunting ground for centuries. Game meat had only spread among the common people during the Meiji period, but the country folk had been eating it for long before that. At first it was just a settlement of cabins for the hunters from nearby villages to rest or shelter, and places to skin and prepare meat. But once the people realized how rich the area was in game, they began colonizing the place. As a result, a part of Kami Fujiyoshi was born, and the people began living here as either farmers or hunters. The settlement had no name yet. However, these extremely old documents refer to it as Okami Village, or something similar. Not Okami as in Okami-sama, though, but Okami as in wolves, the canine beast. Apparently this place really had wolves before, not mountain dogs or badgers, but actual wolves. That was no secret though, the Shinai shrine run by the Miguruma had actual wolf bones in it. However, according to the documents, during the settlement's development, the place was often attacked by wolves that caused major damage. They'd probably tried many things to deal with them, but the documents wrote down one very simple method. The people of the wolf village prepared a human sacrifice and consigned them to flame. Human sacrifice. It was a practice that had existed in Japan for a long time. During construction or whatnot, people would be killed and buried as offerings to prevent misfortune. I'd heard of human sacrifices made to prevent bridges being taken away by floods, or people buried during castle fortification. It was a pretty big deal. Still, it wasn't weird to do it to prevent a beast-related problem. It did seem like a plausible story, so I wasn't surprised. Neither of us were specialists, but from what I knew, people tried to benefit from sacrifices by later on worshipping them as gods. I'd even heard that the pillar kanji used to count gods was based on the term for human sacrifice. Anyway, following the sacrifice, the beast attacks subsided and the settlement continued to grow. At this point, the upper settlement, once known as Okami village, now Kami Fujiyoshi, was surrounded by cabins and other settlements. Though, through irrigation, these settlements gathered water from the wolf village. One of these settlements was a dangerous place that was often covered in mist that led people to their deaths, and for some reason the locals found it really important. Kyunosuke, his great-grandfather, and myself figured that it had to be Yasumizu. And if they took water from Kami Fujiyoshi, it wasn't hard to imagine that the hierarchical relationship between the settlements had already existed then. In agricultural societies, the settlements that controlled the supply of water were extremely influential. After all, if they stopped the flow, the settlements below would dry out. It was even related to the Yasumizu rebellion that Kyunosuke told me about. I couldn't ignore this point. Though there was no mention of Yasumizu or the local superstitions yet. All that the documents said was that the wolf village was steadily progressing as a settlement. However, there was a mention of a fearsome beast yokai, or god that ate people. Though it was only mentioned in the oldest documents, then never heard from again. A god, a powerless god, that's not enough. The legends don't say anything about... Wait. A badger? Do you hate that name? Not at all. It is not wrong in the least. It is a fitting name for someone wearing the marks of Great Lord Shinai and acting as leader of these mutts. So why not try joining me? My land may be small, but I will make sure you are not bored. It had to be God. She said she was defeated by Great Lord Shinai, but never mentioned when it happened. To the left side of the kanji for God, there's a radical for show, and it's even more obvious in its old form. This means that the result is Okami, great God. I was close to the truth, but for now back to the history. Fujiyoshi had started out as your typical hunting, farming settlement. Things changed after about a century when life in the settlement had stabilized. By this point, the records left by the outsiders started noting that there was a strange village in the mountains. The sources had started to become many and varied too. I was curious about how the great-grandfather got documents from Kyoto and Tohoku. But anyway, these reports were records written by travelers who'd stopped here. Many of them were interested in the local customs. One was their hate for mountain fires. It was so bad that outsiders weren't allowed to make any flames, and they themselves had a special watering hole where they did it. One was their worship of a humanoid wolf statue. They asked it for good fortune in the hunt and a peaceful life in the mountains. One was the special misty place where travelers were summoned and welcomed by sensual women. Some rumors mentioned seemed hardly believable, but some of them were still alive, and I was surprised to know how old they were. What bothered me was the fact that there were many records of the invitations to the misty place, but nothing about getting killed there. In fact, most of them mentioned eating good meat and veggies and drinking good sake while having fun with beautiful girls. It was safe to assume that the Feast of the Yomi Purge hadn't existed back then. It was closer to the traditional treatment of guests as described by Rikako. By the way, you seem pretty hung up on guests. Is there some sort of local culture related to that? Yes, I hear that Fujiyoshi was once full of visitors who came to the Shinai Shrine to pray for good hunting. Hunters from the outside were considered honored guests and treated kindly around here. However, there was one thing she seemed to be wrong about. The strange village in the records was a completely different place than the one built around the Shinai Shrine she spoke of. In fact, there wasn't a single mention of Shinai at this point. The general area here was marked as Kachihara. Would things change if we continued further? Anyways, we kept reading. Such records continued for 2 or 3 decades, but then there was a period that wasn't recorded at all. Apparently the travelers who'd made their way to the area started being chased out, and that was it. The settlement suddenly became isolated. Without any documents from the village itself, it was hard to know exactly what had happened during this time. But according to the Nosato documents, this time period was how far they could trace their lineage back. After that, the settlement showed up in records another century later. It was the middle of the Edo period, peaceful times, and the amount of records appeared to have exploded, along with the name Shinai. There is a hidden mountain where the people worship a wolf-faced god and prosper because of it. It is said that the hunters who do not pay their respects to him get lost or injured in the mountains. It is a spiritual place that a mountain ascetic should visit at least once. Their prayers seem to heal all. There are oracles who can predict the future with great accuracy. The non-believers who step on the mountain are in for a terrible fate. The name of the god they worship is Shinai, and the village is called Fujiyoshi. So that's it. I lurched forward and shouted with excitement. True, I did hear that this village was once called Fujiyoshi. But what's so important about that? It's the same trick with the name Shinai. When you take apart the kanji for Shinai into those, and you can rearrange them into Okami, great god, which is also phonetically identical to wolf. Oh, you're right. Hey, wait, then you mean this is the same? Look at the name Fujiyoshi. The first kanji contains the radical for dog. Dog covers the animal radical that's used on the left of this kanji. Keeping that in mind, you line that up with the yoshi of Fujiyoshi to get Fujiyoshi. If you broke apart the first kanji, you'd get person, dog, and good. Then by combining the latter 2 kanji into one and putting the whole thing together again, you got Hito Okami, or werewolf. Werewolf. Hito Okami. Does that refer to the Okami, or to Great Lord Shinai? The two of them are essentially the same. One takes the form of the peaceful god, Great Lord Shinai, while the other takes the form of the resentful Okami. They both take the shape of 3 werewolves, but do different things. I really can't blame people for seeing them as the same. Let's not forget that we have documents saying that there was a culture here that worshipped werewolves at least a century ago. They probably had some beast attacks, started holding human sacrifices, and built a primitive faith around werewolves, and as time passed, that evolved into Shinai. Okami is a divinity born during one of those stages, and to the people of that era, they were the same thing. The villagers of Fujiyoshi were fully aware of their religion's peculiarities, and even hid that in their own village's name. Why did they hide it in the first place? We'll find more hints up ahead. You're right. Let's move on. The great-grandfather seemed to have noticed these hidden words too. The reports that followed generally described Fujiyoshi as it was. Though their strange practices were now considered rituals and it seemed to prosper as a cult village. It was a mountain village far from the rest of civilization, yet it prospered through the money left behind by guests who made the trip regardless. There were now two types of guests here: the ones who visited the place to hunt, and the ones that came for religious reasons. The writings from the later dates included lots of those left by monks who'd come here to study the culture. All of them were surprised by the strange faith and legends of Fushioshi and praised the strength of their belief. Some wrote about the faith in detail. Many of them clearly named the four head families and the legend about the five guardians. The hunters, however, didn't leave many writings. Or rather, it wasn't even their writings. Besides a couple reports by local lords or of someone hunting down large beasts on Mount Shinai. There were also those that simply mentioned men who went hunting in Fushioshi and never returned. One of them clearly stated, "Do not hunt in Fushioshi in the summer. The people of Fushioshi speak of the curse of Yasumizu." I see. Fushioshi has changed a lot over the century. Yes, it's fair to assume that all the local names and stories were created during this time. Yasumizu seems to be leaving a different impression too. The hunters who visit this place don't come back. That must mean that... The feast of the Yomi Purge had begun. The history continued. After a while of prosperity due to its Shinai cult, Fushioshi began to deteriorate come Meiji. The new government, centralized power, rural areas began to be developed. And religious reforms established Shinto as the state religion. The anti-Buddhist movement of that era planned a complete separation of Shinto and Buddhism, destroying many Buddhist temples, customs, and cultural assets, dealing another blow to the village and its faith. This could easily be found in the Nosato records, but it was admitted here that the Uematsu were particularly damaging for them. Well, there was no denying that the Uematsu culture seemed Buddhist in nature, and the prostitution part must have made them targets of harsh prejudice. The Shinai faith, which had many strange rituals, had to either cease and discard them, or turn them into something more culturally acceptable. However, they did keep a few of them. Before moving on to the next chapter, we put together the region names of Fushioshi, which the great-grandfather rediscovered from the archives. According to him, Fushioshi had several districts, each one under the jurisdiction of the village heads. The Miguruma had Fushiki, where the Shinai shrine was built. The Higuchi had Hoshizuki, where people gathered. The Nosato had Tomeguchi, the medicinal plant field right beside Kagegawa. And last, the Uematsu were given the Hacho, the lodging area. According to Kinosuke, these regions remained in Kami-Fujiyoshi to this day. In fact, the names of these regions had existed from the era when the name Fushioshi began to spread to the outside, as was the designation Kami-Fujiyoshi. On the other hand, places aside from Kami-Fujiyoshi had already been clearly identified and named, such as Yasumizu. Not Yasumizu spelled with the kanji for rest and water, but rather rest and lord. I see. My great-grandfather reached the same conclusions as us then. If you swap the kanji for fushiki around and combine them into one, you get comb for hair. With Hoshizuki, you do the same trick, then combine them to get liver. Huh. Kagekawa was originally written as that. Put the first kanji on top of the latter and you get bone. Tomeguchi is a no-brainer. Put Guchi on top of Tome and you get foot. And with Hacho, you place the second kanji between the first to get claw. So the region names of Kami-Fujiyoshi were divided up and based on body parts. And then we get to the real spelling of Yasumizu. Break the first kanji down and you're left with person, tree, and lord. Combine the latter two into one kanji, then put the full word together and you get human sacrifice. That was him that said it. Whatever. His great-grandfather seemed to have no clue about the purpose of the names. However, he did guess that the oldest one was either Fushioshi or Yasumizu, while the other names were new. He concluded that link between those names and the words werewolf and human sacrifice was related. There was another thing here. He guessed that Kami Fushiyoshi was named after body parts to represent a single human as a way of responding to or opposing Yasumizu. Another guess was that by burying the sentiment in the name instead of burying people in the ground, they'd avoided killing their own. Honestly, it seemed to me like we didn't have enough to understand the true intention behind this. Though the fact that they hid the words human sacrifice in Yasumizu was pretty shady. You could assume that it was named that because it was a human sacrifice meant to help the area, including Kami Fushiyoshi, prosper. Or perhaps it was related to the human sacrifice from the origin of the village. Regardless, there were definitely ulterior motives behind the names. As one who knew Yasumizu's future, I was certain of that. Fushiyoshi and Yasumizu had become Fujiyoshi and Yasumizu during the Meiji period, and became part of a single area. The great-grandfather concluded that the naming was based on local conventions and that it was meant to hide the village's past. He had nowhere to continue from here, and his writing in the diary ended. The next section was started out by Kyonosuke's great-grandfather, but after his writing grew worse and finally stopped, his son took over. According to Kyonosuke, his great-grandfather had gotten a mental illness and began acting eccentric. He'd seen it with his own eyes. The final reasonable bits of writing left behind by him cursed his deteriorating mind and hoped that his descendants would take over his research. His wish was fulfilled when Kyonosuke's grandfather found this room and took over. This section was primarily made to give detailed descriptions to the outdated rites and customs of the Fushiyoshi. Naturally, the lack of historical accounts was a hindrance. However, the documents owned by the Nosato family and the knowledge he gained as the head made it possible to do it. He was also married to someone with ties to the Miguruma, so he also gained access to some Miguruma records. Having gathered info from various sources, he reached some reliable conclusions. Though his efforts to gather information had made him the target of the other head families. His mind also seemed to deteriorate during his twilight years. The final bits of writing in the diary seemed to scream his fear of death. He died on May 1st, 15 years ago. The text here made it evident that he died in the Feast of the Yomi Purge. As the hand of the supernatural looms over us and takes our lives, I realize that I am losing control of my mind. Now that I have seen the might of the god I was to venerate, what duty do I have to continue the previous head's research into our homeland of Fushiyoshi? I will probably be hanged tomorrow, and in all honesty, it seems like a favorable outcome at this point. What if the irresistible urge to sleep faded, and I opened my eyes to see the wolf-faced god? I would be unable to bear the fear. The wolf's bane I shall use to end my life lies in my hand. And that was it. Kyonosuke's voice was shaking. From what he said, his grandfather was an intelligent gentleman that he knew personally and respected immensely. Anyway, the text here could be summed up as thus. Fushiyoshi had several strange rites and customs. When combined with the ones unique to specific head families, the number grew exponentially. It revealed all the details about these things and even had info we really didn't care about right now. The content about the Uematsu was particularly harsh, even though it was noted that not everything was here. Info about the Miguruma, however, was extremely limited. However, it was said that horrible screams could be heard from their storehouse. That day, I playfully opened the iron door to the basement of the third lookout. Lookout, I think it said. I was told never to go there, and the door had that symbol on it. And it was a morbidly interesting read, but there was only one thing that mattered to us. It was the custom of lynching in Yasumizu. It was basically describing the Feast of the Yomi Purge. The Okami would return from Yomi to get revenge for being killed. The story was the same. There were two notable points here. One was that it had apparently begun about 500 years ago, after the village closed itself off from the world. and the other was that Kami Fushioshi was mostly uninvolved in the feasts of that era. Kyonosuke's grandfather examined the feast's origin from various angles. He investigated the stones in the Hanging Pines graveyard, looked at the records of Kami Fushioshi's mason, and concluded that Kami Fushiyoshi were making the graves. Oh, so it was actually... I know what a mason is, I was just like confused on why that... Yeah, okay. And according to the mason records, the Okiba were placed in Yasumizu at this time too. 500 years of history was enough to make it a historic landmark, but there were no megaliths from millennia BCE. They were simply put there to help turn the village into a great Lord Shinai worshipping holy ground. The words left behind by the elders of Kami Fujiyoshi and Yasumizu gave us even more info. There was the legend that, in a time when samurai still existed, Yomibito poured out of Yasumizu and attacked Kami Fujiyoshi. That coincided with the rebellion Kyonosuke had mentioned, the reason why the head families oppressed Yasumizu. Looking at both the documents and word of mouth, the rebellion had happened 5 centuries ago, shortly before the village became isolated. In Yasumizu, Yomibito were said to be scary creatures, completely covered in blood water. You could find the word blood water by playing with the kanji in the name Sadanaga. Bloodwater Rapids. The stream was considered corrupted even half a millennium ago. Anyway, though the legend was warped by superstition, there was no denying that Kami Fujiyoshi was attacked by people covered in Sadanaga mud. The grandfather concluded, without a doubt, that this incident was what made Kami Fujiyoshi people so afraid of Yasumizu. The rebellion was the very cause of the decades of isolation, the creation of the Shinai faith, and the start of the Feast of the Yomi Purge. As for what that meant, it was all planned for the purpose of holding the already discriminated Yasumizu down and preventing further rebellion. The grandfather thought that Yasumizu was purposely created to be discriminated against. It was a bad, dangerous place to live in. The reason why it wasn't abandoned wasn't mentioned here, but anyway, people continued calling it home. In governing, intentionally creating a lower class and treating them poorly satisfied the upper class and thus made their governance easier. It was something you saw all over the world. Even in Japan, there was complicated historical discrimination that left its mark even on the current era. Thus, the presence of a settlement meant to be looked down upon was good for the leaders of that era. However, they didn't want any more rebellions. So how could they stop it? One way was to make them fight amongst themselves. Another was to make them so superstitious they wouldn't even think of rebelling. Basically, they had to make them believe the lie that there were wolves among them who were killing people, causing them to kill each other. By doing that, they would sap any strength Yasumizu needed to rebel. They also prepared a background story to make them believe that the anomaly was actually real. The grandfather guessed that this was the true purpose of the 5-century-old religion. The sources for that were documents gathered by his predecessor, which claimed that people from the local temples and shrines were called into the village. He assumed that the incomplete or intentionally destroyed records were those regarding the scholars they summoned to help create the religion. That seemed absurd at first, but after thinking about it, was entirely reasonable. The settlement they'd looked down upon had bared their fangs at them, so what did they do? Call the smart people for help. That was natural. And so, those scholars teamed up, created a new religion, and made the settlement fight itself. And if they'd given the head families roles in the legends to ensure proper control... Man, it sounded messed up, but it didn't seem impossible. It's the other way around. It's so that the people of Kami Fujiyoshi wouldn't have to look into the eyes of the people of Yasumizu, who may or may not be Yomibito. They wanted to avoid eye contact, not only because they thought they were corrupted, but also because they were afraid. Kami Fujiyoshi was afraid of Yasumizu. It was a possibility I wouldn't have considered before, but it also seemed likely. It would be pretty scary if the people they looked down upon finally let their grudge take over and become fearful marauders ready to enact their revenge. And because they were aware of how badly they treated the settlement, the guilt grew even larger, and they started controlling and discriminating against them even further. When you looked at it that way, they'd made a whole religion just to protect themselves. And boy, was that insane. Now, with the feast's origin revealed, what was that about the head families not being involved in it so much? Apparently the first feasts were a lot simpler than the current one. There was the purification, sheltering, dreaming, and the limit of one per day, but there was no actual punishment for breaking these laws. They'd probably set it up to prevent indiscriminate massacres. Also, there was no wolf selection, and there were no guardians. The heads, or Fushioshi leaders of that time, only circulated the Yasumizu legend that the wolves came back. By spreading the local legend along with a lie, they motivated the people to kill each other whenever the mists appeared. It was successful, and the people started killing suspected wolves every time the mist showed up. In response to that, those who spread the suspicions were brutalized at night. This weakened Yasumizu, left the place a breeding ground for future problems, and too weak to rebel. Wait, that doesn't make sense. Why would they kill each other just because of that? How can there be murders without any real threat? The past isn't the present. There were times when superstition could make people murder one another. Your grandfather used the word lynch right from the start. I think that's important. I think that the Feast of the Yomi Purge was actually useful to the people of Yasumizu too. What do you mean? Let's keep reading. Sure enough, the grandfather seemed to believe that to the people of Yasumizu, the feast made the killings into a just cause. According to this, the feast wasn't considered a paranormal event, not even by the Yasumizu people themselves. It was just a justification for lynching. The hand of the law didn't reach this backwoods village, and Yasumizu was even more isolated, a settlement for the ostracized. Of course there had to be conflicts and wrongings, and the social system to solve them was limited. Thus there was demand for solutions beyond the law, and the feast fit the bill perfectly. When the mists came, they could easily get rid of people they didn't like. However, that came with the risk of being targeted by their friends and family. This continuous cycle of lynchings and revenge eventually destroys the minority and leaves the majority wounded. The feast ends and law returns to Yasumizu. It seemed like the ostracism they'd done in ancient Greece. Anyone who was against the law of the village had their names written on pottery and voted to be exiled. A backwards but effective way to keep order. Though while the punishment there was exile, the feast came with a death penalty. It was clearly unjust, but they found it better than nothing. By having these occasional unlawful disputes, they actually prevented the settlement as a whole from crumbling. Those who participated in the lynchings had their guilt lessened by considering the legends and myths. Superstition had real-world effects. By telling people that they'd be hanged if they were bad, the renegades amongst them would be silenced. So yeah, the Feast of the Yomi Purge had its perks for both Kami Fushioshi and Yasumizu. Also, apparently it was a long-running tradition for Kami Fushioshi to do certain things immediately before the mists came. They summoned the children of Yasumizu to Kami Fushioshi and called the woman to help them with food. There was no end to these records. It was much like the mountain festival. The carrot for the stick they constantly provided the settlement. But it was also a form of population control. They didn't want Yasumizu to be completely depopulated, so they protected the children. This tradition was alive to this day. Even 8 years ago, Tai, Kaori, and the children had been saved from the feast when they were called. So, while it had its roots in superstition, the Feast of the Yomi Purge became a kind of a social tool. I see, controlled lynching, or perhaps capital punishment by popular vote. It's only useful to us Kami Fujiyoshi people, and it doesn't spread outside of Yasumizu. Muro and the youths are right, the village heads are the bad guys here. Not sure about that. The leaders from that era might have intended this to be a kindness meant to ensure stability. The problem is that it continues to this day. Yes, this is something that shouldn't be happening in Yasumizu today. Is that what it says? It says that there were free feasts during and after the war. The feast meant to manage society had ended with the one that began at the start of World War II. When Kyonosuke's grandfather wrote this, he called it the previous feast. The ones who survived it said that an actual wolf had appeared. Also, rules like sheltering, which had been ignored until then, now came with a supernatural punishment. The legend had gone from mere story to reality. The grandfather himself had witnessed some paranormal things too. There was a pile of dog corpses that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The thorough, violent deaths given to the rule breakers. The wolves who could come in through locked doors and brutalize the ones inside. And finally, the unity between the wolves, hell-bent on killing the humans even if it meant their own death. That was the feast I knew. The next text was written by the previous head, Kyonosuke's father, and he'd observed the third feast of the recent times. It was the one that happened 8 years ago, and its survivors mentioned impossible paranormal events that actually happened. It was the same, the exact same. The feast had been supernatural 3 times in a row. And this was the 4th one. That meant that something had drastically changed with the feast that happened during the war. The reason for that wasn't given here. You okay? It must be shocking. Should we take a break? No, I'm fine. Let's keep reading. Next is the text left by my father. Like Kyonosuke said, the final section of the diary was written by the previous head of the Nosato family. He'd inherited the will of his predecessors and tried solving this mystery. Though unlike them, he seemed to prioritize documents that had been released to the public. For one, there were cutouts of articles. He'd taken various clippings from newspapers and magazines to create an extremely large scrapbook. There were bits from local newspapers, national ones, and both general and specialized magazines of varied renown. Basically, he'd gathered all the info regarding Fujiyoshi, no matter how minor. Of course, we didn't have the time to look through all of them, so we relied on the index in the diary. We found out that this small village had a number of unexpectedly major events happen in it. They were so big that they actually made it to national newspapers. Some of the oldest and more notable ones were the articles about the serial murders that happened here over 60 years ago. There were a number of articles with titles like 20 deadly break-ins in Fujiyoshi and murders in 20 houses in Mountain Village, and I found that number to be significant. Though the number of places that had been attacked was 20, the number of casualties was 17. 8 more were injured. Regardless, it was definitely big enough to make a mark in Japanese history. This event was well covered for something that had happened on the eve of World War II, and it ended with the culprit being sent to Tokyo and quickly executed. The incident was reported for 2 years, from when it came to light right up to the capital punishment. It could be summed up like this. On December 27, 1940, in Fujiyoshi village, Kamifujiyoshi Hochizuki, a man covered in mud invaded a private dwelling. He quickly used the kitchen knife he had to attack 2 of the people inside, destroy property, and then escape. One of the victims went on to die. The culprit went on to continue invading houses in Hochizuki, murder and destroy property. After 30 minutes of this, he escaped Fujimura by foot. The crime was so sudden that the inhabitants and the local police couldn't do anything about it before it was over. The incident came to light when the local police reported it to the Metropolitan Police. Since cars weren't widespread in the area yet, the doctors from the surrounding villages hurried over with their horse-drawn carriages. That was how much of a big deal it was. The police had gathered a number of officers and established a perimeter to surround the culprit, but in the end they failed to arrest him. The witnesses, bloodstains and the lost items made them conclude that the culprit had changed his clothes somewhere up the mountain, then escaped by going down the river. They followed after him, but since it was the end of the year and it was hard to get around, it took them time to find proper footprints. On January 3rd of the following year, the prefecture police noted that the perimeter was broken, but this wasn't reported. The investigations that followed bore no fruit, and the newspaper and magazines wrote a lot about the escaped or hidden murderer. But then, at one afternoon at the end of January, a man showed up in a police station in Mangetsubashi, Tokyo, and said that he was the murderer who'd escaped Fujiyoshi. There had been much speculation about where the culprit was from, but it turned out that he was actually a local, which raised a few questions. One of them was, why couldn't the locals figure out who it was? This question was left unanswered, and the man who turned himself in, Kihei Tochitani, 30 years old, became a subject of significant controversy. From this point on, the major newspapers simply reported how the trial was going, while the magazines just had a ton of opinion pieces. Kyonosuke's father commented that the Miguruma were actively keeping journalists from entering Yasumizu. At the same time, they didn't resist the police, and in fact were highly cooperative. But in the end, Yasumizu wasn't really mentioned in the trial reports. It could have been the weak legislative system of the time or the result of the Miguruma's efforts. Under such circumstances, they held Kihei Tochitani's trial. He insisted on several things. That he was too drunk to remember the details. However, he was certain that he was the murderer. He'd lived in that area and was on bad terms with his neighbors to the point of holding a serious grudge. When he sobered up, he became scared and ran away, and since he knew he couldn't keep running forever, he just turned himself in. He was too afraid to return to Fujiyoshi. Some had found his statement that he'd attacked 20 households in 30 minutes questionable, but it was a trial under significant public scrutiny. And since Kihei Tochitani admitted to the crime, he was executed based solely on that. It happened 2 years after his arrest. The capital punishment was carried out, and he departed this world without further comment of note. The news agencies were now all covering World War II, so these serial murders ended up being forgotten. Also, Kyonosuke's father noted something about him. 3 years before the incident, Kihei Tochitani had been sent to Yasumizu because of trouble with his neighbors. This is interesting. It is. Kihei Tochitani probably based his crime on the Yomibito legends. He wasn't in Yasumizu for long, yet he went and did something so awful. All of Fujiyoshi is afraid of Yomibito, so maybe he turned it around and tried becoming one with them to seem scary. Or perhaps he'd heard of the old rebellion that we village heads know about. I'm mostly curious about the timing. The feast during the war, the first real one, happened about 2 years after this incident. It's like a repeat. Yes, it's like that time 500 years ago when they created the Shinai faith to keep the rebels in check. Of course, there were no mentions of the feast in the articles. The next notable thing was the time when the war ended and the soldiers returned to Fujiyoshi. These new news articles were accompanied by village PR notices and photos. One of the men in the photos had the name Shosaburo Makishima. That face and expression, I had no doubt that he was related to Kanzo Makishima. Many from Fujiyoshi had departed for the war, and naturally some of them were from Yasumizu. Also, according to the reports, they had a notably good survival rate. They'd also achieved a lot on the front lines, and the PR said it was the blessing of the Okami. In a different document, it was said that they had charms that resembled the Okami symbols used in the mountain festival. There was a photo that showed one of these crests wrinkled from wear. The shape was new to me. However, the 3 diamond-like symbol made me think that it was related to the one I was familiar with, which was actually pictured here. The text next to it said that some chose to wear ominous symbols instead. For reference, there was the divine crest of Great Lord Shinai. It was actually my first time seeing it, and apparently they couldn't use it as a good luck charm because it was just too important. Well, then, if it was that sacred, it made sense that I hadn't seen it in Yasumizu. It was a bad place after all. Next, we skipped the unimportant bits, such as the election result and major staff changes. We went ahead a few decades and arrived at an article from the 80s. This was pretty bad. Cholera outbreak in mountain village, 4 dead. It was a pretty simple incident, apparently. Someone who'd gone on a trip overseas had infected the village. The name of patient 0 was hidden, but it had to be one of the village heads. They were the only ones here who could travel to other countries. It was damn awful to read about, but apparently the disease spread through water contaminated by the first victim's vomit and excreta, and there were victims in both Fujiyoshi as well as Yasumizu. Also, it was only reported after the disease had subsided, which was probably caused by the Miguruma intelligence network. Looking at when it happened, you should have been alive during this, right? You were in middle school, I assume? Yes, I know about it too well. I was infected myself, after all. Huh? You had cholera? Yes. In fact, it got to a lot of people, especially here in Yasumizu. What? Even those still here? It happened to Sir Makishima, Yamawaki, and oh yes, even Muro had it. The outbreak must have been pretty big. It was. Later on, I found out that the Nosato quickly identified it as cholera, but the Miguruma... Huh? What? They made the absurd claim that Shinai's protection would make short work of the cholera, and performed some strange ritual while attempting to prevent the Nosato from applying proper treatment. Thanks to that, the situation grew worse, and I, who got infected late, had my treatment postponed because I was one of us. I see. The Nosato are a family of model doctors. As if we simply adhere to the order established by the Miguruma. Of course, Yasumizu was low on the list, and that caused the deaths of 2 infected, and 2 uematsu who were treating the people. What? 2 uematsu? The uematsu still had a few members back then, and most of them were infected while trying to make use of their folk medicine. Once that was found out, the disease had advanced so much that they were beyond help and died soon after. It's safe to say that event sealed the fate of the uematsu. If the Miguruma had handled things properly... No, that's not it. If the Nosato had done what any proper family of doctors would do, and simply ignored them and done the right thing. By the way, was Rikaku Uematsu infected? She was only 9 at the time. Surely you understand that she was too young to partake in the family trait. Oh, I see. I knew what he meant, but something didn't feel right. His eyes betrayed a sense of confusion, and his tone lacked confidence. Are you hiding something? No. It's nothing. Anyway, though this shows how warped Fujiyoshi is, it's not directly related to the feast. Yeah, you're right. I wouldn't push any further this time. Another major article was one about a corpse that had washed up in the local part of Saranaga, officially known as Saranagawa apparently. It was a woman from Chiba, and she'd had a search party out for her. It said that she'd simply committed suicide. Is this related to the feast? No, the date doesn't match any of the feasts so far. She must be just an unrelated suicide victim. Then there's the idiots from the city coming here just to hang themselves or getting eaten by wild beasts. Me and the old man always have to deal with the mess. It's not rare for Saranaga to bring us corpses either. I don't know if they're mountain fishers or something, but it's dangerous upstream, damn it. A city person who'd gone all the way here to die, huh? Well, maybe one of the village heads had her killed, but if that's the case, he wouldn't have left her in Saranaga. Then let's ignore that. What's this about a heavy rain from 8 years ago, though? It doesn't seem related to Fujiyoshi. I feel that it's important that Fujiyoshi is not mentioned there. There's reports of landslides all over the area, but none for Fujiyoshi. Oh, I see. So even the ones who supposedly died in the landslide were hidden from the public. Besides that, there's nothing of note. What about this? Serial fires in Minato. Possibly arson. Why is it here? It's explained in the diary. It's not reported, but all the 7 buildings set on fire belong to the same person. What does that mean? It's the Miguruma. They have real estate outside Fujiyoshi as well. See, so they gain funds that way too. But why would they do this? Because their religion is profitable, no? A faith with 500,000 of history behind it can't be considered a new religion. there must be a lot of Shinai believers outside as well, though they're probably not as fanatical as us. I imagine that some of their families have been donating to the shrine for generations. Are the Miguruma a recognized religion? I don't know that much, but I imagine that the country would be pretty involved with them if it was, no? I don't know. I'm not well versed in that. Now this seems to be the end. Yeah. We'd read the entire diary. A whole 3 hours had passed since we'd started. The mist would come soon. I'd learned a lot from this, but if you ask me, all I'd gotten here were maybes. Nothing was certain yet. Even so, I thought it was more than enough for this loop. And I think that's where we're going to end this episode. I've been recording for 2.5 hours, and my voice is alright, but my throat hurts, so we'll leave it at that. So, I hope you enjoyed watching. Thanks for doing so, and I will see you next time. Till then, bye bye.